Today on Black Coal Woodworking, I'm going to restore my wife's easel. As you can tell, it's got more paint on it than the canvas got. I built this thing about 15 years ago and haven't done a whole lot to it since. By now, I've learned a bunch more things that I could do to upgrade this a little bit. You can also tell that it's extremely wobbly. That's just one finger, and I'm able to move that whole thing. You can see when I take out these screws, they were not glued on, and I went and screwed in to end grain, which isn't a great idea either. On the stretchers that go across to hold the canvas, they were literally a piece of Project Pine cut out and nailed to that thing with any number of nails. It's a little interesting trying to get that off, but I was able to get it. That's better. Over on the back side, the way I had made this thing stand up was in a way that I could make it collapsible by using some carriage bolts and washers. Now, the piece of wood that attached the washers and carriage bolts were also not glued on, and they were also just extremely loose. This whole thing was going to fall apart if you touched it with another paintbrush. The actual main part of the easel was glued together, and that was still strong. I took a 60 grit sandpaper to it and basically sanded all that paint away. It actually went a whole lot quicker than I thought it would. I think my wife normally paints with either acrylic or oil or some kind of water cleanup oil paint, and all that stuff seemed to come off without a problem. I didn't even end up gumming up the sandpaper. Now, one of the upgrades I wanted to make was to give that stretcher where the painting sits on a backing. That way, when you paint, you don't push the canvas right off the easel. To do this, I cut a 2x4 down to size. I put it through the jointer with the help of shop helper number 2 and just basically squared this thing up. I put the one flat side on the jointer to get a nice flat edge there. Then I rotated the piece and put the freshly flattened piece of lumber up against the fence, and now I've got a nice square edge that I can take over to the planer. Over at the planer, I just stick that remaining top surface through and make it parallel to the jointed side, and then I raised it up and stuck the long end, I don't know what you want to call it, but squared up the other remaining surface. After that, I took it over to the bandsaw, resawed it in half because I wanted to make a shelf that isn't the thickness of a 2x4. This shelf's going to be about 3/4 inch by about 3¼ inches. At the table saw, I cut out a rabbet, and that way I can stick the vertical piece to that shelf into the rabbet. And you can see there, I just kind of finished that rabbet up. I made a quick sacrificial fence for my table saw, and there you go, a nice little rabbet. To connect these two pieces, I added glue to the rabbet, stuck them together, and then with my nail gun, nailed them together, just because I didn't want to wait for the glue to dry. To attach this new shelf with backing to the existing stretcher, I'm just using glue and some nails. What I did is it worked out well to put it on top of my table saw sled, but you'll notice that my nail gun and I did not get along very well, and almost all of the nails actually just went straight through and curved. I couldn't shoot straight for nothing. Even the other side, I still had a nail go through. So I spent some time pulling those out by hand and sanding them so that nobody's going to hook their fingers on that. And this is the final glue up for it. Over at the jointer, I squared up a piece that's going to become the top piece of wood to hold that painting down on the easel. After the jointer, a quick trip to the planer, as always. Then at the bandsaw, I needed to cut out a notch so that I could fit the washer in there. And about 1/3 of the way through this thing at the bandsaw, I realized that this would be so much better at the table saw. So here we are at the table saw making quick work of this whole thing. It was a lot more fun doing it this way than it was at the bandsaw, that's for sure. And then to the drill press to make a hole for my carriage bolt, and then I could fit the washer in there. The assembly of this thing went kind of as expected. This time I added glue and I made sure to screw into the long grain. At first it still felt a little bit loose after I put the screws in, but once the glue dried, it was super solid. Those screws are really kind of just there to be temporary, just to line things up. I did the same thing with the leg assembly. I added glue and then I put a screw in there and let it sit very still for a couple of hours just to make sure everything was solid. I did make sure to pre-drill the hole first as well. The hardware also had a fair amount of paint on it, so I had a little wire wheel for my drill and I clamped it into my little vise and I basically went to town on that until I got all the paint off. Now for the final assembly, making sure the wing nuts are tight for all the various components. You can see that the back of that stretcher now is sanded and looks pretty decent. Managed to get all the nails out of there. And this is what it looks like from up front. Yes, the ledge is tall, but I wanted it to be. It's got to have support. And there it is. It was a fun little project to restore for my wife, and hopefully she'll enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.